Oliver Twist is a tragic comedy story which tells us about the injustice and cruelty suffered by poor people, especially an orphan children where they were starved and neglected. The story depicts the impoverished London underworld and to illustrate his belief that poverty leads to crime. Oliver Twist was born on a certain English town about the year 1837 in the local poorhouse. For several minutes after his birth, Oliver struggled to breathe. The doctor and the old poorhouse woman who acted as nurse did little to help Oliver. However, the child won his first lonely battle in life and started to cry. Soon after his birth, his mother passed away, leaving the poor child alone. Oliver was given the surname Twist by Master Bumble, who was a town beadle or an officer. He was a self-obsessed fat man who ill-treated and starved the poor orphan children. Oliver spent his early childhood life under the care of an elderly woman named Mrs. Mann, a corrupt woman who spent most of the money on herself and did not feed or clothe the poor miserable children adequately. When Oliver was 9 years old, he was sent to workhouse so that he could learn the trade pick-a-comb. The board of the poorhouse had recently decided to starve the poor children in hope that they will run away from the workhouse or die, as they didn't want to spend another public funds for them. The starving boys held a meeting, and the boys drew lots to decide who will walk to the master to ask for more food, and unfortunately the lots fell on poor Oliver. After having their first bowl of watery porridge, Oliver walked to the master and said, "Please, sir, I want some more." "What?" The master was astonished. "Please, sir, I want some more," said Oliver. The master aimed a blow at Oliver's head. He was at once locked up to spend the night alone. The board decided to offer £5 to anyone who would like to take Oliver off. Master Sowerberry, the local undertaker who made coffins, agreed to take Oliver to work for him. Oliver was taken to Master Sowerberry's house. Everyone, Mrs. Sowerberry, Noah Claypole, the apprentice, and Charlotte the maid, were unkind to Oliver. One day at dinner time, Noah insulted Oliver's dead mother. This made Oliver furious and he attacked Noah. That night he was beaten and locked in the cellar. Being miserable, Oliver decided to run away. Chapter 2. After 7 days of walking, Oliver reached the little town of Barnet near London. Oliver met Jack Dawkins, or known as Artful Dodger, who bought Oliver food and drink. After the hearty meal, Oliver was led by the Artful Dodger to a dirty, evil-smelling street and to Fagin's house, an old villainous-looking Jew, who later taught Oliver to play the games of pickpocket, much to Oliver's understanding. Chapter 3. For the next several days, Oliver spent his time in removing the mark in the handkerchief and playing the games of pickpocket. One day Oliver asked Fagin to let him go out with Jack and Charlie, as he was getting bored for staying whole day inside the house. As they were walking, suddenly Jack stopped and pointed to the old gentleman in the bookstall, who was quite absorbed with the book. The Dodger grabbed slowly and pulled out the handkerchief from the old gentleman's pocket and ran with full speed, followed by Charlie. Oliver was horrified at the scene, at once understood the meaning of Fagin's games. Being confused and nervous, Oliver started to run, but the old gentleman discovered his loss, and seeing Oliver running, he shouted, "Stop, thief!" Soon he was chased by the crowd and caught by the policeman. Oliver was taken to Master Fang, a magistrate, a very bad-tempered man, who was going to sentence Oliver for 3 months of hard labor, but just at that time, the owner of the bookstall rushes in and told Master Fang that Oliver was innocent. It was the other 2 boys who committed the crime. The old gentleman, whose name was Master Brownlow, took pity on Oliver and took him to his house in Pentonville. Chapter 4. The Doctor and Charlie came back to Fagin, who questions them about Oliver. They tell Fagin that police have him. Fagin was quite angry with the boys, while at that time Bill Sides and Nancy visited him. Bill Sides was a dirty, cruel, and downright mean person. Fagin told Sides that he feared if Oliver told the police about them. They resolved by persuading Nancy by threats, promises, and bribes to go to the police station to find out about Oliver. Chapter 5. Meanwhile in Pentonville, Oliver was put to bed with a high fever by Mrs. Bedwin, who was Master Brownlow's housekeeper, and there he stayed for many days, receiving the best care and attention from his new friends. One day, Mrs. Bedwin carried Oliver downstairs. Master Brownlow came to see him, but suddenly he exclaimed, "Why, what's this?" Looking from Oliver's pale face to the portrait of a beautiful lady which hung above Oliver's chair, they were all shocked at the likeness of Oliver with the lady in the portrait. Nancy, after getting information that Oliver had been taken ill, then released and taken away by the old gentleman to the neighborhood in Pentonville. When Oliver was going to the bookstall to return the book, he met Nancy and Bill Sides along the way. Nancy starts screaming, "Oh, my dear brother," and she flung her arm tightly around his neck. A crowd gathers and Nancy convinced that Oliver was her runaway brother. Bill Sides came and dragged Oliver back to the dirty, mean street of Thief's life. Chapter 6. Once again, Oliver was among the thieves. When Nancy saw that Fagin once again tried to strike Oliver with a big stick, she seized the stick from his hand and flung it in the fire. She began to regret of her decision of kidnapping Oliver. Fagin planned to send Oliver on a burglary mission with Bill Sides and Toby Crackit to the countryside around London. Chapter 7. When Bill Sides, Oliver and Toby Crackit reached the house, the one that they planned to rob, Bill Sides pointed a gun at Oliver and told him to get inside the house through a small window. At gunpoint, Oliver enters the house with the plan to wake those within, but before he can, he is shot by one of the servants. Sides and his partner escape, leaving Oliver in a ditch. Chapter 8. After the robbery failed, Toby Crackit came to Fagin's house and told him that Oliver was shot and left alone in the ditch. Fagin was furious and went to search Bill Sides, but he was not at home. So he returned back, but before he unlocked the door of his house, a man named Monks called him, and so they both entered an empty room, leaving the candle outside. While Monks and Fagin were talking about how to make Oliver a thief, suddenly Monks saw a shadow and said, "Oh, what's that?" Fagin cried, grasping Monks as he leaped up. Monks told him that he saw a shadow of a woman on the wall. They looked in all the rooms but found no one. As they could not find anyone, Monks finally agreed that it was his imagination, but he would talk no more and finally went away. Chapter 9. The next morning, an injured Oliver makes it back to the same house that he attempted to rob, where the kind owner, Mrs. Miley, and her beautiful niece, Rose, decided to protect him from the police and nurse him back to health. Oliver slowly recovered and was extremely happy and grateful to be with such kind and generous people, who in turn are ecstatic to find that Oliver is such a good-natured boy. When Oliver was well enough, he told Rose one evening that he was worried about Master Brownlow and Mrs. Bedwin, who had no idea what happened to him. Dr. Losborn, who treated Oliver, has been kind enough to take him to see Master Brownlow, but he finds his house empty. He has moved to West Indies. Chapter 10. Oliver enjoys spending time with Mrs. Smiley and Rose in their country cottage. 3 months pass happily, the happiest of Oliver's life. Only once was Oliver's happiness marred. That was when Oliver went on an errand to the nearest small town. He bumped into a tall man wrapped in a cloak. This man had a dark red mark on his cheek. He glared at Oliver with hatred and cursed at him. One day, however, Oliver awakens from a nightmare to find Fagin and his mysterious partner, Monks, staring at him through his window. Oliver raised the alarm, but the two men escaped. The Jew, Oliver cried to Harry, the son of Mrs. Smiley, and the doctor who came running. They all tried to search the Jew and the monks but could not find them. Chapter 11. In this chapter, we find that monks bought the ring and the locket of Oliver's murder from Master and Mrs. Bumble. Mrs. Bumble told monks that she got the ring and the locket from the woman who nursed Oliver Twist's murder on the night she died. She stole it from Oliver's mother, and when this old woman or Sally died, she gave it to Mrs. Bumble. The ring has the name Agnes engraved inside it and a date within a year of Oliver's birth. After buying the ring and the locket from Mrs. Bumble, monks threw it into the rushing river in order to eradicate Oliver's identity. Chapter 12. Meanwhile, Mrs. Smiley, with Rose and Oliver, escorted by Dr. Losborn, stays 3 days for holiday in London. One evening, when Rose was about to go to bed, Nancy came to visit her. In this meeting, Nancy told Rose about Monks and his relationship with Oliver. Nancy overhears Fagin and Monks plotting against Oliver. She discovers Monks is Oliver's half-brother who wants to destroy Oliver so that he or Monks can keep their father's whole inheritance. However, Nancy tells Rose that she will not betray Fagin or her abusive boyfriend's sides. Rose, who came to know through Master Giles that Master Brownlow is in London, went to his house along with Oliver. Rose privately tells Master Brownlow about Monk's plot against Oliver. Master Brownlow and Master Losborn then strategize about how to find Nancy so that they can learn more about Oliver's parentage. Chapter 13. Fagin grew suspicious on Nancy when one evening she tried to leave the house at 11 o'clock at night. Sides asked Nancy, "Where are you going at this time of night?" To which Nancy replied that she needed some fresh air. Sides did not allow Nancy to go out that Sunday night. Fagin thought that if Nancy had grown tired of Sides' cruelty and had found new lover, they all might be in danger. Fagin was suspicious of Nancy's covert actions and sent Charlie Bates to spy on her. Chapter 14. Rose tells Master Brownlow that they must meet Nancy again to find out how to find Monks. They meet Nancy on London Bridge at a pre-arranged time, but Fagin has become suspicious and has sent Charlie Bates to spy on Nancy. Nancy tells Rose and Master Brownlow how to find Monks, but still refuses to betray Fagin and sides or to go with them. Charlie, who was hiding and listening to whatever Nancy told to Rose and Master Brownlow, reports everything to Fagin, who tells Sides, knowing full well that Sides will kill Nancy. When Bill Sides reaches home, and in his fury he grabs his pistol and shot Nancy twice. The poor girl fell on the floor, nearly blinded by the blood which flowed from her head. She raised herself feebly to her knees and breathed a last prayer for mercy to her Maker. Chapter 15. Master Brownlow, along with 2 large men, kidnapped Monks and forced him to confess. Monks admit to Master Brownlow that he has been plotting to disinherit his half-brother Oliver. Monk's real name is Edward Leaford. His mother burned his father's will immediately after his death in an effort to disinherit his father's mistress, Oliver's mother Agnes. Monk, who is now known to everyone as Edward, further confessed that he paid Fagin to turn Oliver into a thief in order to destroy his life. Chapter 16. In this chapter, we find that Fagin was taken by the police, whereas Sides is on the run for murdering Nancy. An angry mob chases him down, and he eventually hangs himself accidentally in falling off a roof while trying to escape from a mob surrounding him. Chapter 17. Eventually, under pressure from Master Brownlow, Monks testifies under oath about how he tried to swindle Oliver out of his inheritance, but Oliver agrees that he will share the inheritance with Edward. Monks also confesses how his mother burned the will and about the locket and rings of Agnes that he bought from Master and Mrs. Bumble in order to destroy Oliver's identity. Monks, who is now known to everyone as Edward, further confesses that he paid Fagin to turn Oliver into a thief in order to destroy his life. He also gave Oliver's identity papers to Fagin for safekeeping in order to hide the truth about Oliver's true patronage and his rightful inheritance. Monks also said that Agnes' father had 2 daughters, and when he died, some poor cottagers took the child and brought her as their own. But soon his mother found the child and she tried to ruin the child's life. Monk's mother wanted to take revenge on Agnes' sister by telling lies about her family to the cottagers, which made the life of the child miserable until Mrs. Smiley noticed and adopted the child as her niece. After this amazing revelation, it turns out that the child was Rose and she is the aunt of Oliver. Oliver was very happy and said that Rose will always be a dear sister to him. Master Brownlow said to Monks that he will equally divide the property between him and Oliver if Monk agreed to leave the country and never return. Chapter 18. Soon Fagin is arrested, brought to justice and sentenced to death by hanging. Master Brownlow and Oliver visit him in prison. Fagin eventually tells Oliver that his identity papers are hidden in a canvas bag in the hole of its chimney. Master Brownlow officially adopts Oliver as his own son. They live in peace and comfort, close to both Miley's and Master Losborn in the English countryside. Though Oliver, in his first 9 years of his life, lived a very miserable life, but at the end of the story we find that Oliver finds happiness with the people who love and treat him with kindness. Thank you.